Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for the iQuits webinar series, The Evidence Behind E-Cigarettes, Risks and Benefits. Our presenter today is Dr. Ann Joseph, MD, who is a co-investigator on the iQuits research program. She is a Wexler Professor of Medicine and General Internist at the Department of Medicine at the University of Minnesota. She received her medical training at the University of Michigan and received a Master's of Public Health and Epidemiology from the University of Minnesota. She is currently directing the Applied Clinical Research Program in the Department of Medicine. Her primary research interests are in tobacco control. Her work has focused on smoking cessation and smoking reduction interventions for special populations of smokers that experience unique barriers to delivery of tobacco treatment. So I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Joseph for the remainder of the webinar.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining. Today we're going to be talking about e-cigarettes, a certainly interesting and somewhat controversial topic these days. I have no financial relationships to disclose. So this is a short outline of what we're going to be covering, a little bit on the history of e-cigarettes, what an e-cigarette is, descriptions of the use and uptake of e-cigarettes, some information about the vapor and secondhand vapor, health effects, and then a discussion of the potential for e-cigarettes to help people quit smoking or switch from combusted tobacco to e-cigarettes, and product regulation. I'll summarize the pros and cons that will come up, and then we can have some questions and discussion. So RJR Tobacco developed some cigarettes that were really the precursors to e-cigarettes in the 1980s. You may recall the name Premier or Eclipse cigarettes, and they really didn't take off. They were non-combustible cigarettes, just like our current e-cigarettes, but they delivered very low levels of nicotine. And they took the direction of evolving into a nicotine inhaler. That we discussed a pharmacologic delivery of nicotine in the earlier webinar. But a Chinese pharmacist named Han Lick developed the first marketable e-cigarette in 2004, and it was patented in China and first came to the United States in 2007. Since that time, the sales of e-cigarettes have really taken off in a geometric way, so very slow at the beginning. But as you can see from this graph, especially between 2013 and 17, so bear in mind when you look at this, 2008, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 are all 1 year apart. And 17 is obviously 4 years later. But there's been a tremendous growth in e-cigarette sales. There are some predictive models. Of course, you never know whether these are going to turn out to be true, that e-cigarettes could, revenue from e-cigarettes could overcome revenue from traditional cigarettes in the future. And because of these models, the tobacco companies have been very interested in the potential of these products. In fact, now, the tobacco industry is very heavily represented in the e-cigarette market. So this table shows in the left-hand column some tobacco companies that I'm sure you're familiar with the names of: Altria, Reynolds, Lorillard, British American Tobacco, Imperial Tobacco, and Swisher. And some of those have acquired e-cigarette companies, some of them have made new e-cigarette companies, and the corresponding brands are in the right-hand column: Mark 10, Vuse, Blue, Vipe, e-Swisher. I'm really not going to be talking about brands of e-cigarettes today, but we will make some distinctions between the different types of e-cigarettes. So what is an e-cigarette? There are really 4 groupings of e-cigarettes. There's a disposable e-cigarette. This is sometimes called a cig-alike. It looks like a cigarette, but is still composed of a battery and a cartridge and an atomizer. There's a rechargeable e-cigarette, which still looks like a cigarette, a cig-alike, but you don't have to throw it out, and you can fill it. Then there are pen-style, medium-sized rechargeable e-cigarettes, and then there's the tank-style, large rechargeable e-cigarette. But what's common to all of these 4 types of e-cigarettes are these 3 major components. There's got to be an energy source, so there's a battery, which either is disposable or rechargeable. There's an atomizing unit that creates the vapor, and then there's a cartridge that contains the nicotine. And as you might guess, from the beginning of the introduction of e-cigarettes to now, there's been kind of an evolution of different generations of e-cigarettes. And what's been discovered is that both the battery power and the technology around the atomizer are very important to satisfaction from these products. So this is a picture. It may be difficult to see, but it just shows you some of the things that have been added. And these are things that the user can vary. So, for example, the power and voltage that the battery uses can be controlled by the user. They can be recharged in a USB port and so forth. So it's an ever-changing market, which is one of the reasons it is difficult to do research on these products. The market is changing faster than we can start and complete studies, and the products are not necessarily comparable one to another from a technology point of view. So where do you get e-cigarettes? So I think now it's hard to escape seeing these vape shops. They're sprinkled around various parts of town. And I'm just going to show a couple of pictures of these. Some of these are very sort of entertainment theme-oriented, and there's wide availability of e-cigarettes through the internet. In fact, there's some affiliate marketing schemes for e-cigarettes where you can start out as a product user and become a distributor and earn profits from recruiting customers. It doesn't take long to become a salesperson on commission, and there's a range of products to support people that want to do that. One of the things that the marketing of e-cigarettes has to be careful about is that it is not a cessation product. So e-cigarettes have not been approved by the FDA as a smoking cessation treatment, but the marketing makes hay with words, and so sometimes, for example, it's advertised as a smoking sensation product, which obviously could be very confusing to consumers. So there's a whole host of things to buy, and then there's a whole set of styles that one can buy, and some of the most heavy users of e-cigarettes tend to use these personalized vaporizing systems where they will put together a tank and a battery and their own nicotine liquids, and we'll come back to that. This is actually a little bit of an old picture, but the FDA now does regulate e-cigarettes, but that is a very recent, starting in 2016. And prior to that, in vape shops, this was very much the picture that you could see. So kind of a homemade brew version with labels that would describe the flavor of the liquid and the nicotine content, which could range from 0 to quite concentrated. So who's using e-cigarettes? And when you compare the populations, this is from different countries and different types of research projects, but usually in a hopefully representative sample of the general population. Vapors compared to non-vapors or cigarette users tend to be younger, a little bit better educated, a little higher income, and equally distributed between men and women. So one of the things that is of concern is the increase in e-cigarette use among youth. So what this graph shows is the current e-cigarette and regular combusted cigarette use among middle school and high school students between the years of 2011 and 2014, using data from the Youth Tobacco Survey. So sorry, the print is a little bit small here, but you can see that first, if you just look at e-cigarette use, so the lighter blue, there is an expanding pool between 2011 and 14 in both middle school students and high school students. Now, if you look at the traditional cigarettes or combusted cigarettes, and that's the dark blue, and look at the exclusive use of those, there actually is a decrease of exclusive use in both middle school and high school students over this same period of time. And then there's a large group that use both products concurrently. But if you sort of blur your eyes and stand back and look at these bar graphs and realize that e-cigarettes over this period of time are increasingly available, the number and the percentage of kids that are using some tobacco product, if you include e-cigarettes, has gone up, not down, during this period. So this is data from the CDC, again showing that profits from e-cigarettes could surpass those of regular cigarettes over the within about 10 years. So what about the fluid? The fluid has three main components. It has humectants. So humectants are the things that make the fluid vaporize. And typically it's propylene glycol, and we'll talk a little bit about propylene glycol in a couple of slides. It sometimes is glycerin, but usually propylene glycol. The second fluid component is nicotine, and the third is flavoring. So e-cigarettes come in a huge number of flavors. And I'm not sure if you can read this, but this is one ad showing the beverage flavors, the fruity flavors, miscellaneous and tobacco flavors. And what you can't help but notice on these is a lot of them have very candy-like names: raspberry lemonade, Oreo cookie, coconut twist, and things that at first glance are likely to appeal to kids. They also have a lot of tobacco flavors and menthol tobacco, many mint flavors, which are popular with menthol smokers. Propylene glycol, as we said, was a humectant that produces the aerosol. It is an FDA-approved food additive, which is sometimes in cosmetics and in some medicines. It's the material that's used if you see fog or smoke in, say, a theatrical performance. But you also might remember that sometimes before using it, there'll be a sign or some kind of notice in the program saying that propylene glycol can cause irritation for some individuals, and it's sort of a heads-up warning that that may be coming. The problem with propylene glycol is that in e-cigarettes and in vaporized tobacco, it's inhaled into the lungs. And this same speech is going to hold true for the flavoring. So, I'll just spend a moment on this. If you, as a physician or as any kind of clinician or biologist, if you've studied how the human nasal pharynx and airway is put together. There are lots of things that are designed to keep the lower respiratory tract, basically your lungs, completely clean. So, for example, we make mucus in our nose and in our throat. And mucus is a sticky kind of gummy substance that traps particulate matter. So if you've been out gardening or doing a dusty work job and you cough or blow your nose and it's gray or dirty, that's your nose and your throat doing a good job collecting the particulate matter so it doesn't go down into your lungs. Similarly, we have cilia, which are, it's C-I-L-I-A. They're small, kind of fuzzy hairs all down the lining of your throat, and they beat. And they can, if there is mucus or particulate matter, they beat the material back up into your mouth where you typically would cough it up. So all of these body components are designed to keep the lungs crystal clear. So given that knowledge and everything that we know about other lung diseases, you know, coal miner's lung, farmer's lung, it's as a physician, I have to say, kind of intuitive to me that you would want clean air going down into your lungs. And a chemical like propylene glycol is something that I would be concerned about sort of on principle. Having said that, there are no long-term studies of the effects of propylene glycol on the lung. Okay, well, let's spend a little bit of time on nicotine because that's the part of tobacco that makes people dependent and addicted to tobacco. So we talked about this during the last webinar, but large amounts of nicotine can be lethal. It takes more to be lethal in an adult than a child. Nicotine has a lot of pharmacologic effects. The ones that are most driving for tobacco use behavior are CNS effects that include pleasure, arousal, vigilance to repetitive tasks, improved task performance, relief of anxiety, and of course dependence. Nicotine increases the heart rate, increases cardiac output and blood pressure by modest amounts, and can cause coronary vasoconstriction, that's the heart blood vessels, and also cutaneous in the skin vasoconstriction. Has effects on appetite and on the metabolic rate as well. So the nicotine that is in fluids, in the e-cigarette fluids, is in a range of concentrations from 0 to 100 milligrams per mil or per cc. There's a lot of concern about labeling not being necessarily accurate, especially because of the lack of regulation, and also including nicotine in non-nicotine fluids. So this is a small study that was published in 2013, but if you look at the table, they tested, it was something, 35 brands, and of those 35, that 10 of them were accurate in the labeling of the amount of nicotine and the amount that was demonstrated in the lab in that fluid. 7 contained more nicotine than the label said, and 18 included less nicotine. So there's a range of accuracy here that is, of course, of concern for the users. This may improve over time, and I suspect that it will. The tobacco industry is very interested in being as proactive as it can to make this a marketable and product where this is sort of low-hanging fruit to make the labeled nicotine content accurate. And if you look at some of these, the range and the percent of label, and these are newer brands, is from 85 to 121%, so a smaller range than the earlier studies. So there is a learning curve to using e-cigarettes, particularly the tank systems, and the smoking behavior. The actual topography of using an e-cigarette is more complicated than cigarettes, because there are these different components that will control the amount of nicotine delivery. And there's a myriad of replacement options if you want to get more or less concentrated delivery. The most common scenario is that people start with a device that looks like a cigarette and move on, do some potential troubleshooting. They can go into a vape shop, talk with owners, and of course the owners are happy to sell more components, and they're not necessarily fully interchangeable. But often there is a time of priming or vaping puffs, puffing harder at the beginning. So experienced users, as I mentioned, most commonly move on to mods, or these modified, these tank systems that have the capacity for modification. So this is a sample. It's a fairly small sample of about 100 users, but you can see that only 8% are using the straight up standard version of an e-cigarette, and 40% are using modified battery housing, and another 40% are using a large or long life proprietary personal vaping device. One of the things that's interesting about an e-cigarette, and also challenging when we try to measure, for example, how much a vapor is using, is that an e-cigarette contains basically sort of a vat of nicotine liquid. When you smoke a regular cigarette, which is shown in the bottom part of this table, you pretty much know when a cigarette starts and when a cigarette ends, and we know something about the average number of puffs. You know, overall, it's around 9 or 10 puffs per cigarette, and you can then measure or ask people how many cigarettes they use a day. But a container of nicotine liquid may have the equivalent of 20 or 25 cigarettes. So especially for somebody that is used to smoking 5 or 10 cigarettes, it's not immediately obvious when they are starting or stopping the same amount of nicotine. So again, the vapor has propylene glycol, nicotine, flavorants, and then we're going to talk a little bit about some of the tobacco-specific carcinogens that are in the e-cigarette liquid. But because it's not standardized and has been relatively unregulated, it makes doing research on these products difficult. So basic question is, might e-cigarettes be safer for your health than combusted tobacco? So the background information, which I'm just going to remind you of, is that we know that combusted tobacco is very dangerous for your health, dangerous for heart disease, for lung disease, for a whole range of cancers, for stroke. And we know that stopping smoking is of great health benefit. So investigators have looked at different e-cigarette liquids and looked at the concentrations of some of the things that we know are bad in tobacco, and looked at the concentrations in a conventional cigarette versus an electronic cigarette. So here is a subset of those: formaldehyde, acetaldehyde, acrolein, toluene, NNN and NNK are nitrosamines, which are carcinogens that cause lung cancer and head and neck cancer. And in all these cases, what you can see is that the average ratio of a conventional cigarette to an electronic cigarette is greater than 1. So there are more toxicants as a generalization in conventional cigarettes than electronic cigarettes. And sometimes there are a lot more toxicants. So if you look, for example, at NNN, the ratio is 380. So that's a huge difference. But at the same time, the levels in electronic cigarettes are not zero. So when we think about using a lot of them or being exposed to them over a long period of time, the risk is probably not is not nil. This is a different way of looking at a similar question. So here are some different products. On the left, electronic cigarettes, nicotine gum, and then 4 brands of cigarettes, Winston, Newport, Marlboro, and Camel. And it looks at the nitrosamine levels, 13.2. So in the nicotine gum, in our pharmacologic nicotine, even lower than in an electronic cigarette. But both of those are far lower than in a regular cigarette. And again, using that ratio model, you see that the levels are considerably higher in regular cigarettes. So there is a secondhand vapor that comes from electronic cigarettes. So when you have a regular cigarette, there are 2 sources of secondhand smoke, if you will. One is from the end of the cigarette, so somebody's holding a cigarette in their hand and the end is burning and releasing chemicals into the air. The other is that the smoker inhales the smoke and then exhales the smoke, and that exhaled smoke has carcinogens. In the case of a e-cigarette, the only source is somebody exhaling vapor. So the exhaled vapor contains the same substances, but as again, as a generalization, the concentration of those substances is much lower than in secondhand smoke. So what do we know about the health effects of e-cigarettes? And there is an increasing amount of data. In this short talk, we don't have time to go through it all, but I thought I'd give you just a flavor of the kinds of work that's being done. Things are being done in vitro and sort of cell systems in animals and in humans, and then looking epidemiologically at large populations of users. So I know that you can't read this slide, but this is an example of the in vitro studies. They took 41 refill liquids and can measure how cytotoxic or how easily those liquids can kill a cell. So this is a common system that's used to measure the toxicity, say, of cleaning fluids or different chemicals that we might or might not be allowed to have on a general hardware shelf. And then they divided this group of refills into low, moderate, and high cytotoxicity, and then looked at some of the common features, for example, of the high toxicity. And one of the things that popped out from this study and others is that sometimes it's the flavorants. So, for example, cinnamon seems to be more cytotoxic than vanilla. So we have to think about all the 3 groups of constituents in electronic cigarettes when we think about cell damage. This is an example looking at pulmonary effects of vaping and looking at conventional cigarettes, a control group, conventional cigarettes and e-cigarettes, and looking at baseline and 1 hour after smoking or vaping. And the baseline is in blue. The red is immediately afterwards, and then the green is 1 hour later. And what you can see is for the tobacco, for the smoke group, and this is pulmonary function, goes down right away, which doesn't happen with e-cigarettes, but if you look an hour later, the conventional tobacco is back up again and e-cigarettes are down. The vote is really out on short-term pulmonary effects of vaping. So, of course, a big question we'd love to know the answer to is, will e-cigarettes reduce the risk of lung cancer? And based on the components of the e-cigarette fluid, you would predict probably that it would, but I'm just going to remind everyone that it would take a very long time to be completely confident of that answer. So what this graph shows is the prevalence of cigarette consumption among men in the U.S. and then the decrease in lung cancer. And what you can see is that, starting in 1900 through about 1950, the cigarette use went up and up and up and up. And then finally, after World War II and with the Surgeon General's report, cigarette use started to decline. When you look at lung cancer among men, the curve is almost identical, but it's 20 years to the right. So it takes a long time to see the benefits of changes in tobacco use. And of course, we haven't had e-cigarettes around for anywhere near that long a period of time. The other thing, and we'll come to this a little later in the talk, is that in addition to questions about long-term toxicity, there are questions about whether people will switch completely to e-cigarettes, whether starting off, whether they could use e-cigarettes to quit and eventually quit everything, whether they will switch to e-cigarettes completely, or whether they will do what looks like is fairly common, which is to use both products together. If people continue to use regular tobacco and e-cigarettes, the risk of lung cancer may not reliably decrease. What are some other things that have been observed with e-cigarettes that are of concern? So there is a group of adverse events that were not completely anticipated. There have been reports of fires and explosions. These often hit the news and are fairly dramatic. And again, I'm not really a betting person, but I would anticipate that the tobacco industry is going to clean up these kinds of risks pretty reliably. So poison control is a really interesting phenomenon. As you saw from some of those earlier pictures, the liquid is in often in a bottle, not with a child-proof cap like we would have any medication, even aspirin or vitamins. And there's been a dramatic increase in poison control reports involving e-cigarettes. These are 50% or more of these are, as you might guess, in children who are probably going for the sweet flavors of some of these liquids. There's been one suicide from IV administration of the nicotine liquid, and vomiting, nausea, and so forth. Other adverse events that have been reported to the FDA are hospitalizations for a host of things that are difficult to know whether they were related to e-cigarette use, but were at least temporarily related to using them, second-degree burns, and one infant death that was related probably to a choking episode, and then a host of other complaints. This shows the number of poison control calls to poison centers in the United States between 2010 and 2014. And there is a steady, it looks a little bit rocky, but it's basically an even curve for cigarettes. And, this is usually from ingestion of cigarettes, but a pretty dramatic increase in e-cigarette related calls. So what about e-cigarettes for smoking cessation? This is a picture for those of you that are in the clinical world that I actually found in our electronic health record one day. This is a physician who tried to order an electronic cigarette as a medical device for somebody that they were probably trying to help stop smoking. But you can't do that. It's not an approved medical device. It's not a approved smoking cessation aid. But there is a lot of interest in whether e-cigarettes would be helpful for people trying to stop smoking. So it's kind of disappointing, but there are 2 clinical trials that have been published on e-cigarettes for smoking cessation. One was done in Italy and one was done in New Zealand. And this table summarizes these 2 studies. One was published in 2013. Both were published in 2013. So one of the criticisms of where we sit right now is they used the older, not so cool versions of e-cigarettes. At the Society for Research in Nicotine and Tobacco meetings this year, I understand that there are 9 trials now underway. So hopefully that's internationally, including all countries. So hopefully we'll be able to get some more helpful information. In these studies, people used the e-cigarettes very much like we would prescribe a nicotine replacement therapy for about 3 months and verified abstinence from smoking. But the results were disappointing in terms of cessation. So this is the first study, the Italian study, and you could look at week 24, which is the long-term outcome, and looking at quit rates. They're very low in all 3 groups and not statistically significantly different, 12%, 10%, and 5% quit rates. In the New Zealand trial, these curves, it's presented a little bit differently, but again, you can see there's no statistically significant difference between different treatment groups with very low quit rates at 6 months on the order of 4%, 6%, 7%. So in my field of smoking cessation, these 2 trials are very controversial, and there are a lot of complaints and critiques back and forth about these. There are groups of investigators, and as a broad generalization, many of them are in the United Kingdom and in Europe, that a group of investigators that have are very strongly supportive of e-cigarettes for smoking cessation. And even though there aren't definitive clinical trials, they have data, large population-based data that are similar to this. And I'll just walk through it because it's a little bit confusing. So the blue line is quit attempts over a period of time between 2007 and 2014. And then the green line is current electronic cigarette use. And they make the case that this dramatic increase in current electronic cigarette use is associated with a bump in quit attempts. But if you look at successful quit attempts, which is the dotted red line, it's not absolutely clear that there is a cessation benefit. But they, in general, we do think the more quit attempts there are, the more likely people are to quit smoking. And so these data have been touted as supportive of the effect of electronic cigarettes on smoking cessation. Now, I think I mentioned another group of investigators. This is a paper that was published a couple of years ago. Neil Benowitz, Stan Glantz, a group of people in California that are more skeptical about the benefits or the effects of e-cigarettes on smoking cessation, have used observational data. So they look at big populations, representative populations of tobacco users, describe their e-cigarette use, and see whether using e-cigarettes is associated with successful quitting. And if you look in the right-hand column, so the odds of quitting, if all of them are less than 1. So that would say somebody that is using e-cigarettes has an 81% chance of quitting compared to not using e-cigarettes. But the confidence interval for some of these crosses 1. So that difference is not statistically significant for all 5 of these studies. But they went on to pool the 5 studies. So the real action here is in the last row of the table. So the pooled results show a 61% chance of quitting, and that pooled result does not cross the does not cross 1, so it's statistically significant. So the conclusion from this group was that it is not improving the likelihood of quitting and is probably lowering the likelihood of quitting. This is a similar study looking at the likelihood of using conventional cigarettes among U.S. adolescents, and electronic cigarettes is associated with about a 7 times greater likelihood of using conventional cigarettes. So what do we do if a patient or person comes in and says, I'd like to try to quit, I'd like to use electronic cigarettes, do you think that's a good idea? So we've got, of course we want people to try to quit, we want to endorse that motivation, we want to keep the interaction going, but this is just a reminder that we do have smoking cessation medications that have a proven efficacy for smoking cessation. They include nicotine gum, patch, lozenge, nasal spray, inhaler, and bupropion and varenicline. So as a clinician, I would typically try to get people directed toward using one of the more evidence-based smoking cessation aids. If somebody has tried all these things and I'm not able to successfully convince them of that, I would explain that e-cigarettes are not a proven FDA-endorsed smoking cessation aid, but I'm always about trying to engage the person in a quit attempt, and on an individual basis would negotiate with somebody like that. I would, if that was the only option they were willing to consider, reinforce the idea of just using electronic cigarettes and no combusted tobacco at all, trying to think about doing that for a period of time, anticipating getting off both things, both products completely. So what about the regulation of electronic cigarettes? So the FDA had a new tobacco rule go into effect in 2016, which extended their authority from cigarettes, cigarette tobacco, roll your own tobacco, and smokeless products to include e-cigarettes. This was a really long-awaited new rule. So the FDA has regulation authority, but if you look around the country, there are all sorts of a big range of regulations about e-cigarette use in public places. This is a really useful, it's a live map that I don't know if people are familiar with the Public Health Law Center. It used to be at William Mitchell. It's now at I think Mitchell and Hamlin are together at the Public Health Law Center. But you can click on any state in Minnesota, for example, and get the detailed sort of live version, because this is really a changing regulatory environment. As a reminder, some things that were major accomplishments in tobacco control included taking the tobacco billboards down, which happened in 1998 in Minnesota, but that doesn't apply for e-cigarettes. This is in 2013. This is an intersection right on the university campus with big e-cigarette ads in a area completely full of students all the time. So currently we have a assortment of state and local ordinances. Some states have tried to ban sales and have banned public use. Some countries have banned e-cigarettes outright. And many Minnesota cities, but not all, have updated their clean indoor air ordinances to include e-cigarettes. So very much a moving target. There's been a lot of advocacy from vapers, and if any of you have been down at the legislature for any of these hearings, they're often represented in providing testimony, and as you might guess, a lot of the advocacy is fueled by the industry, and it's always important to anticipate that if you're participating in any of this work. So a brief summary of some of the pros and cons of e-cigarettes. So here are some potential benefits. Cigarette for cigarette, it looks like there are reduced toxicity and toxic components. So there's some potential for harm reduction with e-cigarettes. There's potential, I think, for smoking cessation, to use them as smoking cessation aid, but that's not yet proven. And they're probably safer to use in public places than combusted products. The argument that many of the Europeans and sort of pro-e-cigarette users make, which is here in red, is that current laws allow nicotine in tobacco, which we know is deadly, and in medications like gum and patch, which we know are not uniformly appealing and have limited effectiveness as a reliable cessation aid. So, you can look at this as cup half full, cup half empty. I think it's important to use those cessation aids, but the long-term quit rates are on the order of 25%. So we're obviously not reaching every single smoker effectively with nicotine replacement products. So the advocates would say, why not get people to a safer place using e-cigarettes? So a summary of some of the potential harms is that dual use is very, very common, and dual use may be associated with less cessation. There may be some gateway use among non-smokers, especially children. It's a way to skirt smoke-free indoor air laws. And we don't necessarily know all of the potential toxicities. Because there's high levels of nicotine delivery, and the products are getting even better at doing that, there is persistent nicotine dependence. And although nicotine itself may not be responsible for lung cancer and heart disease, as a general principle, being dependent on any substance is not an attractive option, because it can run your life. You wake up in the morning needing to get this substance and to deal with the addiction. And I'll just mention that the technology is being used to deliver other drugs. So people will vape marijuana and other drugs, and so there's some concerns obviously about that. So one of the ways I find it useful to think about this is sort of a spectrum of harm. And I think we know the anchor points at either end. Conventional cigarettes are associated with a terrific amount of morbidity and mortality. And we know that completely stopping smoking is associated with great health benefits. We know nicotine replacement therapy, even given long-term, is low risk and associated with health benefits. And then there are these other products. There are modified cigarettes, there's smokeless tobacco, and they probably are less harmful than conventional cigarettes, but certainly are associated with some harm. And electronic cigarettes probably fall in that in-between spectrum, but it's probably depends on the cigarette, and we're not sure exactly where that's going to end up. So I think I'm at the end of my presentation, and we're going to have a few minutes for questions. And I think that we're going to turn the recording off for the questions.
Yep.
Is that right?
Thank you, Dr. Joseph. And we are going to stop the recording and then open up for questions.